The mansion stood silent in the pale morning light, the kind of stillness that felt rehearsed, like a stage before the curtain rose. In the center of that stillness, within a room carved from marble and power, sat an open safe. Its steel door gaped wide, revealing bundles of crisp banknotes, glittering jewelry, and documents worth fortunes. It was a trap, but not the kind meant to catch thieves. It was a mirror, meant to reflect the soul of whoever found it. Hidden just beyond the archway stood Sebastian Langford, 33, CEO of Langford Holdings, and a man as unreachable as the skyscraper that bore his name. Known for his brilliance and ice-veined ruthlessness, Sebastian trusted no one, not after what betrayal had taught him. Trust to him was not a gift, but a currency to be tested, earned, or revoked. And today he planned to test someone who had stirred something unfamiliar in him. His quiet, graceful housekeeper, Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor, 27, had been working at Langford Manor for just over 2 months. She spoke little, moved with purpose, and never lingered in rooms that weren't hers. But it wasn't just her discipline that Sebastian noticed. It was the sorrow behind her composure, the grace in her silence, and the weight she carried as though she was protecting it from the world. He wanted to know, was her integrity real, or just another mask? At precisely 8:42 a.m., Eleanor entered the study. She froze at the sight of the open vault. Her breath hitched. Her eyes searched the empty hallway. Then instead of stepping toward the treasure, she stepped toward the dust. With gentle hands, she wiped the edge of the vault door, not disturbing a single item inside. And then she did something unexpected. She pulled out a photograph, looked at it with quiet ache, kissed it softly, and tucked it away again. She whispered words the hidden observer couldn't hear. Then, just like that, she closed the vault door, turned, and continued her cleaning as though nothing had happened. Sebastian watched in silence, stunned not by what she took, but by what she didn't. The test had become irrelevant. What he saw was something he didn't expect: dignity, restraint, and the kind of moral clarity no amount of money could buy. He had set out to prove people could not be trusted. Instead, he found a woman who reminded him that true strength is revealed not in words, but in what one chooses not to do when no one is watching. This is not just a story of wealth or suspicion. It is the beginning of something more powerful, a story of quiet heroism, unexpected healing, and the moment when a guarded heart begins to crack open. From the moment Sebastian Langford read the private investigator's report, something inside him shifted. Eleanor Hayes was no ordinary housekeeper. Once a dedicated primary school teacher, she had lost her husband in a tragic construction accident and left behind her career to support her twin daughters and care for her terminally ill mother. There were no red flags in her past, no debts, no accusations, just a quiet, tireless woman trying to keep her family afloat in a world that offered little mercy. As Sebastian sat alone in the dim glow of his library, the contents of that report weighed heavier than any quarterly loss he had ever faced. Her story echoed in the silence of the grand estate, filling the space between them with unspoken truths. Suddenly, the memory of her placing a simple photograph beside millions in cash wasn't just touching, it was transformative. It told him she had nothing, yet still chose honor over desperation. He recalled the watch that had mysteriously disappeared from his garden path one stormy night, only to reappear the next morning, clean, dry, and placed carefully on his dresser. He remembered the quiet needlework she had done on the cook's torn sleeve, never asking for thanks or recognition. These moments, once overlooked, now painted a picture of a woman who lived with quiet integrity. She was surviving, yes, but with a grace and strength that demanded respect. For a man like Sebastian, who had long believed trust was a weakness and kindness a liability, this realization was jarring, and yet he couldn't stop thinking about her, not just as an employee, but as a person. Days passed, but her presence lingered. It wasn't in her words, for she spoke little. It was in the way she moved through his home, deliberate, respectful, never overstepping, and yet somehow managing to fill it with something it hadn't held in years: warmth. One rainy afternoon, Sebastian finally called her into the study. He confessed the test, the open safe, the camera. He admitted he had been watching, not to accuse, but to understand. Her response was calm, steady, yet deeply cutting. "I didn't know being decent was something I had to pass a test for." The words struck him harder than any boardroom betrayal ever had. As they stood in that study, no longer simply boss and maid, but two human beings carrying their own burdens, they began to truly see one another. Sebastian saw a woman who had lost everything and still chose to act with grace. Eleanor saw a man who had everything yet lived in fear of trust. In that moment, the walls between them began to dissolve, not with grand gestures, but through small, honest words. Later that evening, when Sebastian found a cup of hot ginger tea and a handwritten note on his counter, "Drink while warm, dry off before you catch a chill," he didn't just see an act of kindness. He felt something he hadn't felt in years: care. Not because of his wealth or his title, but because someone had looked past all that and seen the man beneath. For Sebastian, this was not just a moment of gratitude. It was the beginning of healing. This was the first time in years he wasn't just trying to protect what he had built. He was beginning to build something else entirely, a connection rooted in mutual respect, in the invisible but undeniable threads of empathy and understanding. In Eleanor's quiet strength, Sebastian found a mirror, one that reflected not the tycoon he had become, but the man he once hoped he could be. The days that followed unfolded with quiet, steady rhythm, like the shifting of seasons after a long, unspoken winter. Sebastian Langford, once the embodiment of guarded authority, found himself subtly rewired by Eleanor's presence, not by anything she asked for, but by everything she never did. It was in the silent return of his missing watch, the repaired jacket no one had noticed, the way she moved like a shadow through his home, restoring order without ever demanding attention. Her grace wasn't performative, it was reflex, born of a life that had no room for self-pity, only survival. And yet, despite her silence, her presence began to echo in corners of the house that had long been lifeless. The fireplace he never lit now flickered in the evenings. The windows, once shuttered, let in more light. Even the staff began to speak of her in gentler tones. She hadn't said a word about the safe, but something about the way she carried herself made it clear. She had nothing to prove. One afternoon, Sebastian stood by the tall arched window, watching the rain whisper against the glass. He turned something over in his mind, a decision that had seemed simple on paper but now sat like stone in his chest. The test was over, the results unmistakable. But what lingered wasn't the outcome, it was the impact. She had passed without even knowing she was being tested, and in doing so had revealed something far more confronting, the hollowness of his own life. And so, he called her in. Eleanor entered the study as she always did, neat, composed, her hair tied back, her uniform crisp. But this time, something was different. There was no cleaning cloth in hand, no routine to shield herself with. There was only presence, hers and his, and the space between them, charged with the weight of what had gone unspoken. Sebastian confessed. The safe, the camera, the suspicion, all of it. Eleanor said nothing for a long moment. Then, with quiet dignity, she spoke a single line that struck like a bell in the stillness. "I didn't know being decent was something I had to pass a test for." The words weren't angry, but they were heavy with truth. Sebastian felt them land in his chest, cold and clear, and yet what shook him more wasn't her restraint. It was her understanding. When he admitted to the betrayals of his past, the ex-wife who left, the trusted assistant who stole, he expected distance, discomfort. But Eleanor's gaze didn't flinch. She didn't pity him, nor did she praise him for bearing his soul. She simply listened, a kind of listening that made a man feel seen and not judged. What passed between them in that room wasn't forgiveness. It was recognition. Two people, both carrying scars, both tired of being tested, had finally found a sliver of common ground. And it wasn't in grand declarations, but in something far more rare: mutual vulnerability. When she turned to leave, Eleanor offered one last line. Simple, direct, unforgettable. "Maybe instead of testing people, you should try believing in them." The words stayed with Sebastian long after she left the room, long after the fire died down and the rain softened against the roof. That night, for the first time in years, he sat alone, not with spreadsheets or contracts, but with his own thoughts. And among them, a single truth rose to the surface. Trust wasn't something to be earned by jumping through hoops. It was a gift, and it had to be given first. Eleanor hadn't just challenged his assumptions, She had awakened a man who had been hiding behind his own fear for too long. It was meant to be quiet. That had always been Eleanor's gift, her ability to exist without noise, to carry the weight of survival with grace and invisibility. But now, the quiet was gone, shattered by the sharp, cruel glare of public scrutiny. Her face, once anonymous, now glared back at her from the glossy cover of a tabloid, the maid who stole a billionaire's heart. The headline screamed scandal, its words sharper than any betrayal she'd known. Eleanor stood frozen in her kitchen, her hands trembling as she turned each page of the article. There she was, leaving Sebastian Langford's estate, walking with her daughters, a candid shot of his hand resting gently on her back. It wasn't just invasive, it was unforgiving. It twisted kindness into manipulation, painted love as strategy, and left truth buried beneath a pile of vicious assumptions. What hurt more than the headlines was the doubt that crept into her own home. Her mother's shaky voice over the phone asking, "Is any of this true?" Her daughters returning from school with wide eyes and curious questions. "Mummy, are you really famous?" No one asked how she felt. No one asked what it meant to be exposed. Eleanor's first instinct was to retreat. She stopped answering Sebastian's calls. She didn't return to the Ashworth estate. She felt foolish for ever thinking she could belong in a world like his, not because of the money or the status, but because of how quickly love could be twisted into a story she never asked to be part of. Her life had already been about survival. Now she had to survive her own kindness being weaponized. It wasn't that she no longer trusted Sebastian. It was that she no longer trusted herself to believe in something so good. The whispers at the charity office, the sideways glances from neighbors, even the worried silence of her own daughters, it was too much. And so she chose silence, again, not as an act of punishment but self-preservation. Sebastian, for his part, was no less broken. When he saw the article, rage flared through him, not because his name was dragged through headlines, but because he had failed to protect her. In his pursuit of trust, in his slow, tender effort to love again, he had overlooked the harsh realities of his world. He had underestimated how ruthless it could be to someone like Eleanor, someone who never wanted a spotlight. The press didn't care about her story. They didn't care that she had walked past piles of untouched wealth. They only cared that she was now part of his orbit and therefore a target. And for the first time in years, Sebastian hated the world he had built. He went to her apartment without a plan, soaked from rain and guilt, only to be met with the guarded eyes of a woman he had hurt without meaning to. "I never saw you as a strategy," he said, his voice raw, but her pain was deeper than anything words could mend. "I was never supposed to be in your world, was I?" she whispered. And just like that, the gap between them yawned wider. He didn't argue. He couldn't. Because deep down he knew this wasn't about scandal or reputation. It was about a woman who had been made to feel like her worth was conditional. That night, Sebastian returned to the room where this all began. The study, the safe. He sat in the same chair, staring at the same steel door he had once left open as a test. But now, it was his own heart that felt exposed. And so he wrote, not a grand speech or a calculated apology, just a letter folded carefully and slipped under her door. "You owe me nothing, but I owe you everything, my trust, my silence, and my hope that one day your heart will heal." Eleanor clutched the letter to her chest, unread yet already heavy with meaning, and for the first time since the chaos began, her tears weren't made of betrayal. They were made of confusion, of hope that perhaps this story wasn't over just yet. The hospital corridor was dim, sterile, and painfully silent, except for the distant beeping of machines and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Eleanor Hayes sat hunched on a hard plastic bench outside the pediatric ward, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles blanched. Her body trembled, not from the cold, but from the sheer terror gripping her heart. Hours earlier, her daughter Ava had collapsed at school, her tiny body racked with fever and confusion, eyes glassy, breath shallow. The ambulance had arrived in a blur of sirens and panic, and Eleanor had ridden in the back with Ava clutched in her arms, whispering prayers she barely remembered forming. She hadn't called Sebastian, not because she didn't trust him, but because in that moment of maternal crisis, she believed she had to do it alone. He had already been caught in too much of her chaos, and she wasn't about to drag him further into it. This was her burden, her child, her fear to carry. Inside the room, Ava lay unconscious, hooked up to IVs and heart monitors, her little face pale and drawn. The doctors had been vague, waiting on tests, uncertain of the cause. A virus? Bacteria? Something worse? Eleanor had nodded numbly through their updates, her thoughts spiraling into despair. She had no money left, no resources for the specialized antibiotic treatment they might need to start. She promised the hospital she would find a way to pay. But the truth sat bitter in her chest. She couldn't. Not this time. Not with her mother's treatments ongoing, not with rent looming, not with exhaustion gnawing at every corner of her life. And then came the footsteps, measured, deliberate, familiar. She didn't have to look up to know it was him. But when she did and her eyes met Sebastian Langford's in the sterile hallway light, something in her crumbled. He said nothing at first, just approached, calm and quiet the way one might approach someone on the verge of breaking. Behind him walked a tall, composed man in a crisp white coat, Dr. Henry Maddox, the same private physician Eleanor had once seen in a framed photo on Sebastian's bookshelf. Her voice broke as she whispered, "How did you know?" And Sebastian, gentle and resolute, answered, "Your neighbor called. She said you left in a panic and hadn't come back." No fanfare, no drama, just truth. He turned to the doctor and said firmly, "Room 204, do what needs to be done." And just like that, without asking, without hesitation, Sebastian took control, not of her life, but of the moment, the emergency, the unbearable weight she had been carrying alone. Her pride flared for a split second, trying to protect the final shreds of her independence. But her heart, frightened and raw, silenced it. The tears came, fast and full. Her legs gave way, and before she could fall, Sebastian was there, catching her, holding her, not like a hero rescuing someone weak, but like a man anchoring someone strong who was finally allowed to rest. "I wasn't afraid of the sickness," she sobbed into his coat. "I was afraid of needing someone." Sebastian tightened his arms around her, lowering his head to hers. "You showed me what integrity looks like when no one's watching," he said quietly. "Let me show you what staying looks like, when it matters most." Her walls, built so high for so long, cracked beneath the warmth of that promise. When the doctor returned with a calm smile and said, "She'll be okay," Eleanor's knees buckled again, but this time it was relief. She rushed into the room, kissed Ava's flushed forehead, and whispered 100 promises of pancakes and cartoons. Sebastian stayed in the doorway, his heart full as he watched mother and child reunited. In that moment, the marble floors of the hospital, the ticking clocks, the billion-dollar meetings, they all disappeared. There was only this, a woman who had carried everyone for so long now being held. And him, no longer watching from a distance, no longer testing or questioning, simply standing beside her because he finally understood what love really meant. The rain had tapered into a gentle mist, and the Ashworth estate sat cloaked in gray stillness, its grand silhouette softened by the clouds. Inside the library, the fire crackled low, casting flickers of amber across the oak-paneled walls. Sebastian Langford sat motionless in the chair where once upon a time he had watched a maid walk past an open vault without blinking at its riches. But today he wasn't watching from the shadows. He was waiting, heart bare, soul raw. When the knock came, it was soft, hesitant, and for a brief second he was terrified she wouldn't be on the other side. But when he opened the door, there she was, Eleanor, hair damp from the drizzle, coat wrapped tightly around her. She looked tired, not from the weather but from the storm between them. He didn't speak right away. Words felt inadequate for the wreckage he had caused. She stepped into the room, her eyes scanning the familiar shelves, the mantel clock, the fire. Everything looked the same, yet everything had changed. "You left a letter," she finally said, her voice steady but stripped of all pretense. He gave a small nod. "I didn't know how else to apologize." A beat passed. "You didn't have to apologize, you had to understand." And in that sentence the air shifted. Sebastian gestured toward the seat opposite his, and Eleanor sank into it slowly, her hands folded in her lap. "The headlines," she said, "they called me a liar, a manipulator, said I used my daughters as pawns." Her voice didn't break, but her fingers trembled. "I survived the shame of poverty, the weight of illness, the judgment of strangers. But I didn't expect to be betrayed by the one person I let in. Sebastian flinched. He deserved every word. I didn't leak the story, he said quietly. But I didn't protect you from it either. I should have seen it coming. I should have shielded you from that world before bringing you into it. Eleanor looked at him then, not with anger, but with a tired honesty that cut deeper. I never wanted to be part of your world, Sebastian. I just wanted to be seen in mine. And there it was, the heart of it all. Not love wrapped in diamonds or charity disguised as kindness, but recognition. He swallowed hard. You were never a project to me, Eleanor. You were a mirror. You showed me what I had lost. Dignity, purpose, integrity. I just didn't know how to honor that without trying to fix everything. She tilted her head, a trace of something warmer in her eyes. You don't need to fix me. Just stand beside me. He nodded slowly. That's what I came to say. I'm not here to offer more help. I'm here to ask if you'll let me walk with you, wherever that leads, without conditions. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was necessary. It allowed their hearts to catch up to their words. Then Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table between them. This is Ava's updated medical report. She's doing better, thanks to you, and thanks to me. He looked at the paper, then at her, eyes filled with quiet reverence. You did that, he said, not me. She offered a small smile. We did it, because you didn't walk away. For the first time in what felt like years, Sebastian allowed himself to exhale fully. So where do we go from here? He asked. Eleanor stood, walked to the window, and gazed out at the rain-washed garden. We begin again, she said, not as savior and survivor, just as two people who know how to stay. He joined her by the window, standing close, but not too close. And if I said I still want to build something with you, something honest? She turned to face him. Then do it the same way you waited in that library all those mornings. Quietly, consistently, without needing applause. He nodded. Deal. And in that moment the silence between them wasn't painful anymore. It was peaceful. Two hearts, once scarred by betrayal and guarded by fear, now found themselves learning not how to fall in love, but how to trust again. One breath, one word, one day at a time. The world had always been noisy for Eleanor, between the alarms of hospital monitors, the chaos of raising two young daughters, and the quiet ache of working thankless shifts. But nothing had prepared her for the kind of silence that followed public humiliation. It began not with a whisper, but with a scream, her name plastered across a glossy tabloid, the headline a vicious mockery of the life she had tried so hard to protect. From Maid to Millionaire's muse, clever or calculated. The photo showed her standing beside Sebastian Langford, hand on her back, smile unsure. It should have been a moment of quiet triumph, a symbol of how far she had come, but instead it had been twisted into something ugly. The story hinted she was a manipulator, a gold digger, a woman who had used her children and tragic past to charm a billionaire into her orbit. It stung more deeply than any insult ever had. Not because the world believed it, but because for a moment she feared he might too. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Calls from acquaintances, cold texts from colleagues who once treated her with polite indifference now buried her under suspicion. Even the neighbors, who once left spare cookies at her door, crossed the street to avoid her. At the charity office, where she had been quietly helping mothers like herself, the smiles turned tight, and whispers thickened the air like smoke. But what cut the deepest came from home. Her mother, voice brittle on the line, asked, "Is it true, Eleanor? Did you—" And her daughters, sweet and innocent, looked up from their breakfast table and asked, "Mummy, are we famous now?" Eleanor stopped answering calls. She didn't return to work. She avoided Sebastian's messages, because even if he hadn't betrayed her, she had trusted him to understand the power of perception. And now the world saw her not as a survivor, not as a mother doing her best, but as a headline. She felt stripped of the quiet victories she had earned, rebuilding her mother's care, securing her daughters' futures, and instead dressed in shame she hadn't deserved. What hurt most wasn't the judgment. It was the loss of the one person who had made her feel safe enough to let down her guard. Sebastian hadn't caused the story, but he hadn't shielded her either. In her silence, she wasn't punishing him. She was protecting herself. But pain doesn't linger without reflection. And as the days passed, she sat with her thoughts, not as a victim, but as a woman weighing what truly mattered. Her daughters still laughed in their sleep. Her mother still smiled when she brought tea, and somewhere beneath the ache she realized she hadn't changed. The story hadn't changed her values, her heart, her reasons. It had only changed the noise around her. And in that noise, Eleanor remembered something vital. Dignity isn't something others give you, it's something you decide not to let go of. That's why when Sebastian appeared at her door, soaked from the rain, guilt etched across his face, she didn't throw herself into his arms. She listened. She heard him say he had never meant to put her in the spotlight, that everything he had done had come from the heart, not from strategy. But when she asked, "Was I ever meant to be in your world?" and he replied, "You're not in my world, you are my world," a crack formed in her armor. Not enough to collapse her walls, but enough to let in the possibility of forgiveness. Still, she wasn't ready, not yet. She closed the door softly, not as an end, but as a boundary. A pause. Because love, real love, isn't about grand gestures or magazine covers. It's about standing quietly in someone's pain, even when the world is loud with lies. And in the weeks that followed, as she held his unread letter to her heart, Eleanor didn't weep because she was broken. She wept because in spite of everything, hope had returned, and it had Sebastian's name written all over it. The corridor outside the pediatric ward felt like a tomb, cold, sterile, filled with the low hum of machines and the weight of a mother's fear. Eleanor sat motionless on a rigid plastic bench, her hands trembling, eyes vacant, the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor behind the closed door reminding her that every second mattered. Ava, her vibrant, giggly daughter who loved painting animals and building blanket forts, lay inside that room, her tiny body too still, her breath too shallow. The diagnosis hadn't come yet. The doctor spoke in careful tones, using terms that meant little and everything at once: unidentified infection, possible intravenous therapy, and most ominously, "We'll need to wait on labs." Eleanor had heard them all before during the worst days of her mother's illness, and now here she was again, helpless, terrified, and utterly alone. She hadn't called Sebastian, not because she didn't want to. She had stared at his name on her phone for 10 long minutes, her thumb hovering over the screen like a dare. But pride can be a cruel thing when laced with heartbreak. After the tabloids, after the whispers and the shame, she had retreated into herself. She couldn't risk needing someone again, especially not him. Not when the whole world was already convinced she had used him. But now, in this moment, none of that mattered. Not the scandal, not the charity office, not the judgmental stares. Only Ava mattered. And Eleanor would sell every possession she owned, sweep every floor of every mansion in the city, if it meant saving her little girl. Then came the sound. Measured footsteps down the corridor, each one deliberate, familiar, impossible. She looked up, and there he was, Sebastian Langford, not in a designer suit or accompanied by photographers, but in a rain-drenched coat, his face pale with concern. And beside him a man Eleanor recognized immediately, Dr. Henry Madsen, the renowned oncologist who had treated Sebastian's late sister, now standing by her side, clutching a worn leather medical case. Eleanor's breath caught in her chest. "How?" she asked, voice cracking. Sebastian's reply was quiet, almost reverent. "Your neighbor called, said you left in a panic and never came back." She tried to hold it together, but her knees buckled slightly, and before she could fall, his arms were around her. Strong, familiar, grounding. The dam broke. The sobs came like a flood, her body trembling against him, not from illness, but from relief, from release, from finally letting someone else carry the fear, if only for a moment. "I didn't know what to do," she whispered through the tears. "I wasn't afraid of the sickness. I was afraid of needing someone again." He held her tighter, resting his chin on her hair. "You showed me what integrity looks like when no one's watching. Let me show you what it means to stay, especially when it matters most." She looked up at him then, her eyes raw, not with vulnerability but with truth. "I don't want to be rescued." "You're not," he said, softly but firmly. "You're someone I want to stand beside, every step. Inside the room, Dr. Madsen worked quietly, already administering treatment. The infection was stabilizing, he said. Ava would be okay. Eleanor rushed to her daughter's side, cradling her face, whispering promises of pancakes and cartoons when they got home. Sebastian remained at the doorway, watching mother and daughter, watching love in its purest form, and realizing that he wasn't just helping them. He belonged there. In that sterile hospital hallway where machines beeped and rain tapped the windows, something shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. Eleanor's pride hadn't vanished. It had evolved, from a shield into something shared. Because this time, she hadn't been saved. She had been seen. The study had not changed, but they had. As Claire stood beside Alexander, her fingers gently interlaced with his, she looked at the old safe in the corner of the room, the same one that had once symbolized suspicion, guarded wealth, and a man too wounded by betrayal to believe in kindness. Now it was simply a relic, a reminder of how far they had come. He had once opened it to test her integrity. Today he opened his heart without conditions. His words weren't grand, but they were true. When he knelt before her, offering not just a ring but the promise of a shared life rooted in trust, Claire didn't hesitate. She saw not the CEO, not the mansion, not the power, but the man. A man who had chosen to grow, to believe, and most importantly, to love her without pretense. As her daughters rushed into the room, their laughter echoing off the once cold marble walls, the safe remained closed, untouched. But something far more precious had been unlocked. Forgiveness, healing, and the quiet beauty of two people choosing to see the best in one another. Claire wiped a tear from her cheek, smiling through it all. Her journey hadn't been easy, and neither had his. But the best stories often begin where pain meets hope, and where grace is given freely, not earned. Sometimes the greatest tests in life happen when no one is watching. It's in those quiet, unnoticed moments that our true character is revealed, not in what we take, but in what we choose to leave untouched. Trust isn't built through grand gestures. It grows in silence, in honesty, and in the courage to believe in someone despite the risks. Claire and Alexander's story reminds us that no one is too broken to be seen, and no soul is too hardened to be softened by kindness.